Hi, this is Pat Iyer with Legal Nurse Podcast, and today we're going to be talking about something that affects you whenever you consider making a presentation to an attorney, whether that's at a conference, in a conference room, in an office. I brought on the show Beverly Howard. She's a public speaking and presentation skills expert who works with professionals to help develop and deliver powerful presentations to get real results. Beverly is a certified professional speaker through the Global Women's Prosperity Network, which is where we met in Long Island when we were both at a think tank. And when I heard that she talked about speaking skills, I said, I need to have Beverly speak to you. Welcome to the show, Beverly.
Thank you for having me, Pat. Glad to be here.
I know when we talked about what would be content that would be helpful, we realized that presentation skills puts a lot of emphasis on how you deliver material, but I think it's equally important, if not more, about how you prepare to give a talk to attorneys. Can you share with us some tips that would be useful so that we can focus on the preparation stage?
Sure. The most important point when it comes to preparation is to know what your premise is. And if you're not familiar with premise, that is specifically saying who your audience is, which in your case would be attorneys. You're going to talk about what the results the attorneys are going to get, and then you're going to also talk about how they're going to get it. So one way that we could phrase it would be, the premise of your speech could be, every attorney can get whatever the result is. I'm not sure what type of results an attorney would get from listening to your talk, and they will get this by using 5 simple steps. And so you can rephrase it such as that. Once you get, and can you fill in what that result might be for the legal nurses? Every attorney will get what result by following these 5 simple steps?
The thing that the attorneys are very concerned with is trying to decipher the contents of medical records when they don't have the time or necessarily the knowledge to interpret what's in the records. And when they work with a legal nurse consultant, they can get a concise summary of the medical records that helps them make the appropriate legal decisions.
Good. Okay. And so once they determine what the premise is, then you want to go into developing the content of your speech. So you have your premise, your content could be these 5 simple steps, which could be first step, second step, third step, fourth step. So you want to make it structurally for people to follow you. And meaning you don't want to go all over the place and talk about one thing and then go to another thing and then come back to another thing. So you want to just make it so that people can follow along with you. And then from there, you want to close it out. And I think we're going to talk more about how to open and how to close. But the main point is making sure that the information that you provide in the body of your speech, that is structurally presented in a way that your audience can follow, and you are to make sure that that information supports your premise. Meaning, if you say that the attorneys are going to be able to read and understand medical records, then you're not going to talk about anything as it relates to they will be able to know what's going on in the emergency room. You're going to specifically put it straight for the purposes that you say. And that's all that you want to make sure that you do, that everything that you say supports your premise. And then you'll move on to the opening and the closing. And one thing that I wanted to stress is the thing that a lot of speakers make the mistake of doing is they will create the opening before they even get to the body of their speech. They will develop the opening first and then they'll say, oh, let me work on the body. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure that your body is complete, and then you'll decide how you want to open it.
It's much like what I teach people when I explain to them how to write a book. You write your book first, then you write the introduction to the book, because now you know what you've said in the book. So now you can appropriately open it, set the scene, explain your background as it relates to that content.
Mm-hmm.
You're describing a parallel structure when you're giving a talk, creating the body of the talk, and then figuring out how to start that talk to engage the audience so that they pay attention.
That's correct. And I find that people make that mistake more often than not because they want to have that strong opening, but in many cases does not relate to the topic and the whole point of their speech. It's not touching the premise that they set up front.
Mm-hmm. What should we know about who is in the audience?
What should we know?
Mm-hmm.
You want to know who is in the audience, and say, for instance, you were invited to a seminar or a conference, and you know that a number of attorneys are going to be in the audience. You want to look them up maybe on LinkedIn. In most cases, and I'm not sure how it works in the industry with legal nurses, but in most cases, you will know who the attendees are. And once you get your hands on that information, it's up to you to do your research to find out who's there, find out as much about them as you can. Again, whether it be LinkedIn, you can Google them or whatever process it takes to do that research. And once you find out who it is that you're interested in possibly approaching and meeting, then you'll have that information so that when you speak to them, you'll be able to let them know how you know them. You're not going to just come up to them and just start talking. You already know something about them, and you can carry on a really constructive and meaningful conversation with that person.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I like to do and instruct the people that I coach to do is to speak to the people in the audience before you even get on the stage with them, to have a conversation, introduce yourself, get to know each other, ask them some questions about the event, what do they want to get out of it, just to have a conversation and speak to as many people as you possibly can so that when you get in front of the group, is as if you already know them, you've already made friends, and you can make reference to them while you're speaking and the conversation that you had prior.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And it really warms up the speaker, it warms up the audience. It sometimes gives you details that you can then refer back to. Oh, before I talked, I spoke to this person who was in a law firm who handled personal injury cases, and they mentioned they do trucking accidents and get a lot of medical records about people who are injured in trucking accidents. Is
Mm-hmm.
anyone else in the audience handling personal injury cases? Can I see that by a show of hands? Raise your hand if you handle personal injury cases.
Yes.
So that gets a little bit of engagement, and it also gives you valuable information as the speaker.
Mm-hmm. And it also shows that you care about the people in the audience. I find that that is one way to, if you're a nervous speaker, that's one way to relieve yourself of nervousness beforehand by having that conversation even before you get on the stage
Mm-hmm.
in front of them.
I know that there are several ways that we can consider delivering a talk, different methods. Can you give us some ideas about sorting out what would be the best approach of how we deliver a talk?
If I understand the question, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more, but I'm thinking, are you talking about to deliver a talk that's informative or persuasive or one that
It could
equips?
be that. It could be, do we lecture? Do we build in exercises? Do we put a game into the talk? Do we have it as roundtable discussion? Do we have them turn to a neighbor and share an idea or a concept? How do those types of things play into your planning when you're going to give a talk?
Yes, all of the above. When you're presenting, you want to have variety in your talk. Let's say, for instance, you're given a keynote, you have 1 hour in which to present. You want to include in your talk what we call the 4 A's. The first A would be an anecdote. That's a story as it relates to one of your points. Another suggestion would be to use an activity. And again, all of these things relate to the point that you're making. When in the activity, you will, as you suggested, have the individuals do an activity, stand up and do whatever it is that you direct them to do. You'll invite them to speak to their neighbor, all of the same things that you spoke about. Another one would be to use an analogy. And
Mm.
this is another way in which to do that. And the last one would be an acronym. You can structure your speech as an acronym to say GPS, and when you use that acronym, it helps the audience to know that, okay, we're going to talk about G, now we're going to get to the P, and then we're going to get to the S. So it's a structure that can be used in which the audience can follow and know and not get lost. Because the worst thing that you can do is to make your audience, lose your audience at any point throughout your speech. And again, you want variety, and these are some good ways in which to do it. Some speakers you might see will tell a story, make a point, they'll tell another story, make another point, and throughout the whole speech, it's the same thing. It's fine because stories are excellent. They're an excellent way to keep your audience engaged. But when you do it too much, then people will, at some point in an hour, they'll start checking out. You want to have them engaged. You want to get them involved by doing the other suggestions that I gave,
Hmm.
the acronym and so forth.
I know it's common to use PowerPoint when giving talks, and you and I have probably both seen great PowerPoint, and we've probably also both seen terrible PowerPoint. By
Mhm.
terrible, referring to some of the clip art that used to be common, cramming too many words on a slide, having words jump all over the screen or drop from the top of the monitor. When do you find PowerPoint to be useful when delivering a talk, and when do you think it is a distractor or it can become a negative?
PowerPoint to me is most useful when it's necessary. And again, it goes back to structuring your speech first. You put your speech together, and then as you go through the content of your speech, determine whether or not you do need PowerPoint. And if you do not use it, don't need it, do not use it. One of the suggestions that I would give, because some people, we do have visual learners in our audience,
Mm-hmm.
try to figure out other ways and other visual aids that you can use other than PowerPoint. It might be diagram, it might be a model, it might be even your body. You can use that as a visual aid. And if you do decide that I just must use a visual aid, make sure that it's an image, like just whatever the image is, and a couple of words. It can be an image by itself. It can be an image in 5 words, no more than that. But the point of PowerPoint and visual aids is to aid and not to be the presenter. And as you spoke about, some people will read word for word what they have written on
Mm.
their PowerPoint, and you know, and I know that people will say, if you're just going to read it, you could have just printed it out and handed it to me. What's the point in standing in front of the group? So basically, the goal that you want to achieve is to use it only if you necessarily need it, make images and very few words, and use it as an aid and not your actual presentation.
You reminded me of a room that I sat in New York when I was going to be on the agenda to present a content to attorneys. And the two speakers before me went over their time, and people began to drift out of the room. And the speaker directly before me stood with his eyes at the screen, I'm doing this deliberately, and
Mm-hmm.
read his PowerPoint and never once looked at us ever while he was reading his slides. And when he was done, another portion of the room left, and it wasn't that big of a group to begin with. So it was a dramatic reminder that you can not only impact your own ability to communicate, but you can also impact the other people who are on a panel or coming after you, who suddenly have half the people in the room that they had counted on to be attending their session.
I know, it's really sad. I hate the fact that they invented the PowerPoint, because you have some companies where they insist that you use a PowerPoint. They give you the PowerPoint deck, and everyone has to use that deck. It's really sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But we talked about defining your premise. We talked about planning on how you're opening your talk. There's another piece that we didn't talk about, which is how you are introduced. Do you advocate writing out your introduction, or do you advocate having the person who is introducing you decide what they want to say about you? You know, what types of guidelines should we be following?
You really 100% want to write out your own introduction. This way, the information that you want to impart will be imparted. You will write it out. You can have a short version and you can have a longer version. The short version is specifically about you, Beverly, just like myself, Beverly Howard, certified world-class speaking coach. She'll be speaking to us about how to deliver amazing presentations. A longer version would be about myself a little bit, and then it's going to talk about what the audience is going to get from this talk. And it goes along with the premise as well. You can pretty much thread that premise in there so that the audience knows that this is what this talk is going to be about before I even start the talk. And then once I get started, I'll follow on to that point that, yes, this is what we're going to talk about tonight. And then I go straight into my topic. And what you want to do once you create that introduction, you want to give it to your introducer ahead of time, to give them an opportunity to read it in advance and ask you any questions if they have any. You want to give them the opportunity and instruct to them to read it as it is written. There have been so many people who will introduce you and they've been given these instructions and they just decide on their own to just do it their own way. If you want it to be the way that you intended it for it to be, you want to make sure that you instruct them, please read exactly as written. Now, the day of the event comes, you get to the event, your introducer may have misplaced or forgotten or lost your introduction, make sure that you carry extra copies and present it to them before you're introduced. And the main point is you are be responsible for your own introduction so that you don't get embarrassed by very bad introductions that do not support you or your talk, and it can ruin your talk even before you even start to talk.
I may have told you, Beverly, about the worst time that I was introduced by an attorney to a group of powerful medical malpractice attorneys. He looked at the group and he said, Pat is a legal nurse consultant. I don't have much use for legal nurse consultants. And I wanted to kick him under the chair.
That was so sad.
And he said, but she did help me with the case and I did make a lot of money. So pay attention. And I looked around the room and I could feel like people had lead on their faces. I had to work extra hard to lighten them back up, to win them over, to connect with them, to establish rapport. It took about a good 10 or 15 minutes for me to negate what he had done at that point.
That's right.
And I also had somebody who was supposed to read my introduction. Having learned from that experience, I made the mistake with that guy that I didn't bring an introduction with me. I should have. It was early in my speaking career and I didn't even think about it. But I had one attorney who read my introduction and he thought he knew the name of my company and he completely mangled it and gave me the wrong company name. And if he had just read it the way that it was written, that wouldn't have happened. So I think that's a real good point about bringing it with you. I've also heard have it in 14 size font so it's easy to read. It's not long, and keep it as engaging as possible. And sometimes speakers include something funny in their introduction to help get people laughing a little bit before the talk begins.
And some speakers do that just to gauge the audience, to see where they are, because if it's intended to be funny and the audience doesn't laugh, then they know that this is a serious audience and I'm going to have to work a little bit harder to get to them. And that's the reason why they like to throw that in there.
I know that you mentioned about including stories, and I just wanted to make sure that we covered how to work them into a talk, why they are important. I know there's no formula about how many you use, but how do you structure it so that it just doesn't land like a flat pancake or like a leaden bomb or something that just doesn't turn out the way that you expect?
When it comes to stories, again, you want the story to relate to your talk. And the best way, and the main thing you want to do is evoke emotion. If the story is not evoking emotion, then what's the point? There's somewhat of a story formula in that you want to have characters in your story. You want to have a conflict. There needs to be something going on, because if there's no conflict, then there's no story. Now, when it comes to, as I'm thinking about the type of stories that legal nurse consultants might be telling, they might be telling stories about someone who may have fallen and they ended up in the hospital and they had to make a decision as to how they're going to be treated. Whether, some doctors will tell you, well, get a second opinion or whatever. So the conflict is going to be about, what can I do? What should I do? Should I just take this first doctor's opinion and go with that? Or should I do what most people tell you to do and get a second opinion? And then that's where the conflict comes in. And as the story evolves, you will have the climax where you you made up your mind, you've gotten that second opinion. Now you're at the point of, okay, life is good. I'm going to be okay. This is not a do or die situation. But you want to make sure that you have conflict and then you have a resolution to that conflict, which is the climax. And you also want to know what the change is. How has that person changed as a result of throughout the story? And if you don't see a change, then again, your story is not a strong story. So
Mm-hmm.
those are some of the main things that you want. You want to have the characters, the conflict, the climax, the change in the story. And basically, when you have those things, you're going to go through the emotions. People are going to be able to feel the emotions, and that's how most audience members receive stories, because they want to be put on a roller coaster ride, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so those are the main things that I would say about a story. And also, I believe that opening your speech with a story is a strong way to open your speech. And also at the end is
Mm-hmm.
also a strong close to your speech.
I think also you're touching on something when we talk about stories, which is that it's a way for us to carefully and artfully explain the impact that we can make as legal nurse consultants working with attorneys by telling stories of cases in which our involvement made a difference. So
Yes.
it's a subtle marketing strategy
Hmm.
that is well received and much better received than hire me. Oh, by the way, Attorney Beverly, do you know I could help you with your cases? Hire me. Oh, and by the way, here's my email address and you should hire me.
Right.
As opposed to when I have worked with plaintiff attorneys on cases involving people who fell on ice, one of the things that I have discovered is whatever, and making the point by stressing your experience.
Right. And that's you're describing what we call seeding.
Mm-hmm.
And is, as you said, you're letting the attorneys know that without directly telling them that, yes, these are the types of cases that I've worked on. And if you're looking for someone who's worked on those type of cases, then you know that I could possibly be that person that you
Mm-hmm.
would consider hiring. And again, you're not telling them to hire me, you're just letting them know, yes. And even for me as a public speaking coach, if I say I work with my clients and these are the results that we've gotten, then you know that I'm not just a speaker, I'm also a person who you can hire if
Mm-hmm.
you need.
Yes, yes. One of the surest ways to never be invited back to speak to attorneys is to abuse the opportunity on the platform and start selling instead of delivering valuable content.
Yes. And I think that's not just for attorneys, that's in general, because your whole objective of being in front of people
Uh-huh.
is to give valuable information. You
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to let people know that, you can get value. And if you never hire me, you're going to walk away with some good information.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be more important than whether or not you get the job.
So speaking of hiring you, Beverly, let's talk about how our listeners can find out more about you and the services that you offer.
Well, the best way to find out about me right now is coachbeverly.com. That's my website. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't know what my information is for LinkedIn, but you can find me on LinkedIn and also on Facebook at Certified Public Speaker Beverly Howard.
All right. Well,
Mhm.
thank you, Beverly, so much for sharing your tips with us in this podcast. This has been Beverly Howard and Pat Iyer talking about presentation skills, the importance of knowing your premise for your talk, having a rock solid printed out in size 14 font introduction and telling the person introducing you to read it exactly as it is written. And be sure that you have that with you as an extra copy before you begin mingling with the people before your talk and getting to know some of the people in the audience so that you can refer back to conversations that you've had. You start with a strong opening introduction, which you write after the body of your speech. And if you're going to use PowerPoint, use it appropriately with a few images, couple words, not lines and lines of text which are too small to read in the back of the room and put people to sleep. And by all means, don't read your PowerPoint to the audience. They can read it themselves. Use a variety of techniques to keep people engaged, including some interactive exercises. And weave in some stories and finish with a strong close, preferably a story. Although other ways of closing, I don't know that we talked about that, Beverly, but any tips on how you can close before we close?
Other ways that you can close would be with a quote. You can close with a poem. You can close with a song. There's so many different ways in which to close. But the main thing you want to keep in mind is people will remember the first words you said and the last words you said. So you want to make sure that your last words linger, whatever they may be.
Excellent. That's a strong point. And thank you, Beverly, for that close. And thank you to you who's listening to this podcast. Be sure to come back next week. We'll have another interview, another speaker, a different topic. I value your thoughts and suggestions for topics for this show. You can reach me at patiyer@legalnursebusiness.com. If there's something that you would like to hear about, I'm interested in knowing what's on your mind so that I can invite speakers who will address your questions and your concerns and your needs. Thank you so much for being part of Legal Nurse Podcast.